Hi everyone, Stepan here. I'll continue the series on the modern defense with another sideline, another very venomous sideline for white, and that's the bishop attack. So after the move pawn to e4, g6, the modern defense, once again, if you haven't seen the introductory video to the modern, please do, to grasp the basics. White takes up the center, d4, bishop to g7, and in the previous video we were looking at the move pawn to f4, the three pawns attack. Here we are going to look at the move bishop to c4. Now in the rest of the videos we are going to go over the more common variations. Firstly the main line with knight to c3, the Tiger's modern, knight to f3, which is the two knights line, and the c4, which leads to the Auerbach system. And in this position, after c4, I just want to briefly mention this move, c4, d6, knight to c3. This Auerbach system is probably the most thematic variation for white, and probably the most aggressive one, apart from maybe the main line. But the main difference here, and why I wanted to show you the Auerbach briefly, is that you are hardly ever going to be developing your bishop to c4, and especially in the opening. And the main difference between the bishop attack and the Auerbach system and the other variations of the modern is that white seemingly neglects taking up the broad center and develops the bishop instead. Now, this move has its upsides and has its downsides, so let's go back, d4, bishop to g7, c4. You don't play c4 in the Auerbach system fashion. You don't play f4 in the three pawns attack, which you would play in the three pawns attack. You develop your bishop instead, and this goes slightly against the classical principles, and this is probably the most anti-classical variation white could choose against the modern, because normally against the modern defense you either play c4 or you play f4, taking up more space in the center with your pawns, or you develop one of your knights to c3 or the other one to f3, which is in the classical chess principles where you develop your knights before you develop your bishop, a very sensible thing to do. So bishop to c4 is slightly uncommon, and it's the seventh most popular move, so not many players who play the modern defense will know this move, and that's what makes it so dangerous for them. We are going to look over several responses black has, d6, c6, c5 and e6, and we are going to look at one game in which Topalov played Magnus Carlsen from 2015. Magnus Carlsen had the black pieces, Topalov went for the bishop attack and got destroyed, so we are going to look at what black can do against the modern defense. But let's continue first with the move d6. The move d6 is the most popular move which grandmasters play. Okay, and the move e6 is the best move according to the engines. We are going to go over that last. After the move d6, white has two options. White can either continue with knight to f3, or white can continue with the more aggressive queen to f3. Now, the threat is obvious. After queen to f3, you're simply threatening mate in 1 on f7, and that's one major upside of having the bishop on c4. You are targeting the f7 weakness, and as opposed to the Kolmov system in the Pierce defense, if you haven't seen it, check out that video. In the Kolmov system of the Pierce, black has already developed his knight to f6, so it's much easier to castle. This is also similar to some variations of the Italian, where white is exerting pressure on the f7 square via g5 with his knight and his bishop from c4, and whenever black is unable to castle, it makes the position unpleasant for him, and black is often forced to play moves such as d5, especially in the Italian. So this is one way to exploit the position, and if white chooses to play the move queen to f3, of course black isn't losing. Black simply has to block out this threat, and the best way to block it out is e6. If black plays knight to f6 here, that runs into pawn to e5 and you are losing. So knight f6, e5, and that's it. This is just lost, and you basically can't do anything to save the position. So after d6, white could either go for the very aggressive queen to f3 or knight to f3, which is a developing move. Once again, knight to f3 would be a sensible move according to classical chess principles. Queen to f3 is more aggressive, so let's look at the queen to f3 sideline. e6, knight to e2 developing, supporting your pawn. Of course, black can't have taken the d4 pawn on the previous move because f7 was hanging. Knight c6, putting more pressure on d4. c3 defending, and whenever white manages to get this pawn structure against the modern, I find it very easy to play, and I think that wasting a tempo on c3 and taking up a square for your knight, which normally doesn't go to c3, is good, because then this bishop doesn't have that much influence on the diagonal, and if you can reduce the influence of the g7 bishop, then black's position isn't as good, because in the hypermodern openings such as the modern or the Pirts, the g7 bishop is one of your main fighting weapons. Black here continues with knight to f6, bishop g5, pinning the knight, and now here is something black often plays in this variation of the modern. Black is going to play h6, and now you have to decide what to do with your bishop. There is no rule for where to put your bishop. You can put it on h4 and then to g6. Most often after bishop to h4, black isn't going to play g5 anyway. You can also put it on f4, you can put it on e3. Don't put it on d2 because your knight wants to go to d2. So either h4, f4 or e3. I myself prefer the move bishop to h4 because then I can reroute to g3 and put pressure along this diagonal. Black's most common move here is e5, so we are going to have a clear target. After h3, you want to prevent this from happening. g5, bishop g3 castles, knight d2, e d4, knight d4. This bishop is now very active, and you can look forward to the move e5 yourself in some positions and try to play actively. Now, black's bishop is fine, he's still staring at the c3 pawn, black's knights are fine, all of black pieces are okay, and there's not that much for white in this variation. This is why after the move d6, which is the most popular move humans play against the bishop attack, I would recommend the move knight to f3. Just developing a piece. Queen to f3 is a threat, but you're not playing it to mate on f7, you're playing it for activity and for space, but I still think knight to f3 is better. Black continues with knight to f6, and now this is very similar to the Kolmov system in the Pirts. The only difference is that the knight is on f3 and not on c3, and that's a big difference because now the e4 pawn is undefended, but you still continue with the move queen to e2, same as in the Kolmov, castles, castles, bishop g4 pinning the knight, e5, d5, d5, knight d5, knight b to d2. You don't have that much control in the center. This is probably a fairly equal position. The pawn structure is similar, 3 to 3 on the queen side, 4 to 4 on the king side. You have a slight lead in development. Black yet has one piece to develop. I'm sorry, you don't have a lead in development. You have space advantage, and you might have a lead in development because black is going to have to play some moves to preserve the central control or to put pressure on the e5 pawn. So black continues with knight to b6 here, bishop to d3. Going to b3 is fine, but d3 is a more common move because you sort of stop f5 ideas and f6 ideas, because then g6 is a weakness. Knight to c6, h3, knight d4, you only have one move, queen to e4, and now knight takes f3, knight takes f3, bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, c6, and a very similar position, and for both sides, sort of equal. The only difference is that white has the bishop pair and the position is semi-open, there's no pawn on the d-file, so I would prefer to have white, but once again, nothing major. So against the move d6, best case scenario, you end up with a bishop pair in a symmetrical pawn structure, which is okay, and white is supposed to have a slight edge, but it's nothing major. Now let's look at the second most popular move, the move c6. And we are going to look at the game Topalov Carlsen to show you an example of what Carlsen did. After c6, white plays knight to c3 or queen to f3. You once again choose between moving one of your knights, developing one of your knights, or playing queen to f3. Once again, I believe that knight c3 is a more sensible move. Queen f3 is fine, putting pressure on f7, but after e6, since black hadn't played d6, I think this is more favorable for black because now both of the pawns are supporting the d5 break, and black hadn't lost the tempo on d6. So after knight e2, d5, bishop b3, knight d7, knight bc3, I don't like this structure for white. If you choose to play knight to d2 and to play c3, then still you are going to have a hard time developing your pieces. This is why I really don't like the move queen to f3. The only upside of the move is that black has far too many dark squared weaknesses in his position, and if you manage to exchange this very valuable g7 bishop, then you are going to have an easy time in the middle game, but it's very hard to exchange the bishop. And that's why I think that after the move c6, you should play the move knight to c3, simply developing, stopping d5 and putting more control over the central squares. d6. Black can also play the move d5 here, but I think it's slightly less precise and it's very aggressive. White can continue with ed, and black's best try now is b5, chasing the bishop away, bishop d3, and now b4. And after knight a4, the best move is not even to take the pawn. So this is a pawn sacrifice which I don't really like. And that's why after the move knight to c3, I would recommend d6, simply creating a small center and going for the move e5 later on, or e6. Here white can continue with queen to f3. Black can here choose between knight to f6 and between knight to f6 and e6. I believe that e6 is a better move. Knight to f6 provokes the move e5, and then white gets to open up the position and the black king is still in the center. Now, opening up of the position is going to mean that it's losing for black, but it's going to be easier to play for white. So after knight f6, white simply plays e5. And after d5, d5, knight d5, you have blocked this diagonal, but knight d5, c d5, queen d5, white gets to win a pawn, black castles, and now if white wants to, he can just exchange the queens and be a pawn up. It's better not to exchange the queens, but still, after knight to f6, white forcibly wins a pawn, so even though the engines say it's equal, I would recommend not going into a middle game a pawn down, especially if white can exchange the queens. So after queen to f3, not knight f6, play e6, just defend this way, knight g to e2, knight d7, castles, knight g f6, bishop b3, a normal position. Black has wasted a lot of time on moving his pawns. The c8 bishop is particularly bad and it's a long way away from developing itself, so I prefer white. Now let's look at how Magnus Carlsen treated this position. So, bishop to c4, the bishop attack. Magnus played the move c6, which we've just been over. In this position, Topalov didn't play the move knight to c3, he played queen to f3. And now we have e6, defending this way. Of course, we said the move d5 is coming, knight to e2, what we were looking at, d5, bishop to b3, this is the exact position we had, so Magnus has conceded to having a lot of dark squared weaknesses, but as long as this bishop is on the board, he is fine. Knight d7, knight bc3. This was an okay move. I'm not really sure. Well, I mentioned this problem. If you go to d2, then to play c3, then your bishop is blocked, so this is the best option. Knight e7, castles. Now we have rook to d1, b6, preparing to fianchetto the bishop or play bishop to a6, bishop f4, bishop to b7, bishop to d6, sort of getting into black's position. And here you can see the downside for black, that white has almost a free hand on the dark squares, and if the move e5 happens, then, well, I think that the bishop is going to be very strong on d6. Rook to e8 by Magnus, h3, Topalov didn't play the move e5. We have knight to f6, and now the move e5 by Topalov. And, well, you could argue whether the bishop is useful on d6. I think after the move knight to d7, Magnus wanted to provoke this move, and now white can either exchange the bishop, which is the best move, or leave himself with a bishop which is only influencing a handful of squares. And even though taking was best, he played knight to g3, and now black is just better. Black has no problems. So if you are brave enough to accept all of the dark squared weaknesses then and play like Magnus Carlsen, then this position is fine, but be careful. Knight c8 was played, and now Magnus simply declines the trade and prepares to leave this bishop here or exchange it. Bishop to a3, not wanting to exchange the bishop, and I mean it's an okay bishop, but it's not attacking anything. So what do? If I turn the engine on, you can see that it's minus 0.5. c5 now, the thematic break for black. dc5, bc5, bishop a4, knight c to b6, queen to e2. Even though white has the bishop pair is meaningless, and black has the bishop pair too, but black's position seems so harmonious. I really am not sure where it all went wrong. Let's go back. c6. As you can see, the engines love white in all variations of hypermodern openings. Queen f3. e6, knight e2, d5, this is okay. Bishop b3, this is okay. Main moves, castles, castles, okay. Rook to d1, a slight inaccuracy, but okay. b6, giving an advantage to Topalov. Bishop to f4, going for this plan of bishop to d6. So I guess this plan was incorrect. But what do you do with your bishop if you don't do that? Perhaps it's better to leave it on g3. Bishop b7, bishop d6. Still okay, equal. h3, a mistake. Why did he play h3? I can't really see. Knight f6, e5. And seems that e5 was the crucial mistake. It's defending your own bishop, it's blocking out black's bishop, but it's leaving your position open to this c5 break, and since black has already played b6, c5 is coming. So yeah, I wanted to show you this game just to give you an idea of how dangerous the position is for white, even though he seems to have more space and more piece activity. So c6 is a fine move, and when I was analyzing this game, I thought to myself that c6 is the best response for black. Okay, now let's look at c5. c5 is slightly more aggressive, striking in the center immediately. You can take the pawn, but then queen a5 check, and black wins the pawn back and has annoying pressure on this diagonal. So I wouldn't recommend that. I think d5 is the best move, still with pressure here, but at least keeping central control. The second move after c5 you can play is queen to f3 once again, attacking f7, and now d5. For black is the main move, ed5, cd4, knight e2. A sharp line, but once again I wouldn't recommend the move queen f3, so after c5 play d5. Now black's main move, you might be surprised what it is, it's b5. Taking, of course, no. If you take, you lose the bishop, queen a5 check, so bishop to e2. Queen a5 check anyway, knight to d2, knight f6, c3, keeping this bishop inactive on the diagonal and defending this diagonal so that the knight can move. And of course there was an immediate threat of knight takes e4, so c3 is unpinning the knight, so the pawn isn't hanging. Castles, a4, trying to open up the queen side, e6, d6, bishop e7, e5. What can you say about this position? I mean, taking on g2, this is now a tactical continuation, and if taking on g2, then pawn takes f6, and after pawn f6, white can play bishop to f3 and have two pieces for the rook. So the position is better for white, and black can't really take. The main move is knight d5, but I'm not really sure about this position. White is supposed to be slightly better, but c5 seems like a very dangerous move to face, and this is actually what I'm preparing against the most, because I plan to play bishop c4, the bishop attack, most often against the modern, and my pawns on d6 and on e5 are too overextended, and I don't really like my position. I have a feeling that I'm going to have to play the move f4 and then knight to f3, and my position is going to be weak. Okay, I have pressure on the queen side and I have more space, and in any endgame this is going to be a weakness and my pawns are going to be closer to queening, but I'm not really sure. So c5 is something I'm afraid of, and I would recommend for players with black pieces to try out the move c5. And the last variation is what's best according to the engines, and that's the move e6, simply not giving white the option of queen f3 and putting pressure on f7. The problem with the move e6 is that you're creating dark squared weaknesses, and in conjunction with the move g6, it's considered to be a mistake. And e6 and g6 should never be played together if you follow chess principles, but in this position the engine says it's best. It's a very rarely played move, and I can see why, because if you exchange your bishop then you are just dead on the dark squares, so I wouldn't recommend it, but let's look at what the engine thinks. Knight c3, knight e7, knight f3, d5, striking in the center, bishop b3, knight bc6, e5, and now you can already see what white is going for. If I were white in this position, I would go bishop to e3, queen to d2, bishop h6, exchange the bishop, h4, h5, kill black on the dark squares, and the plan is as simple as that. Castles, the main move here is actually h4. Now, the engine likes two moves, h5 and f6. I think h5 has to be played. If you play f6, then ef6, rook f6, h5. How can you survive this position? I don't think anybody can survive this. This is just too loose. Weakness on e6, weakness on g6. The king is unsafe. The position is just ridiculous. So after h4, h5 would be my preferred move. Bishop g5, pinning the knight, knight a5, attacking the bishop, but castles, b6, queen d2, preparing to play bishop to h6 in some positions, c5, trying to open up the position, rook f to e1, rook to b8, rook a to d1. Yeah, if after rook f to e1 black plays c4, then you still have this move and you're not losing a piece. So I don't really like the move e6. The engines give it at plus 0.5, plus 0.7 for white, so I'm not sure why this is the best. I think c5 and c6 are much more active, and especially since white can have a very huge attack if after h4 black doesn't stop that. So even though the engines think f6 is fine, don't be tempted to play that, because after f6, ef6, rook f6, h5, you are going to have a hard time defending. Okay, those are the 4 moves I wanted to show you. I actually wanted to cover the bishop attack to give the players with white pieces a very strong sideline weapon against the modern, because nobody really plays this. And I hope you learned something. I hope you're going to use it in your own games. I think it's a great opening. And if you play the modern, study Topalov Carlsen 2015 to remind yourself of what Carlsen did. He played with his dark squared weaknesses magnificently, and Topalov was just lost, even though he played fine seemingly. Okay, let me know what you think. Please tell me whether you plan to use the variation. I hope you liked the video, and thanks very much. Stay tuned for more chess. See you later. Bye bye.